Imagine reading a letter from a close friend, only to find out years later that you misunderstood the single most critical word in the entire message.
Oh, that would be incredibly disorienting.
Right, because let us say your friend thought they were talking about a specific political protest, but you thought they were talking about an entire organized religion. That changes the whole meaning of the relationship, the context of the letter, and, well, the way you view that friend's entire life.
It rewrites the history completely.
It really does. Now, what if I told you that one of the most famous theological texts in history, the Apostle Paul's letter to the Galatians, has been fundamentally misread by brilliant historical minds for almost 2,000 years?
Wow.
And all because of a single Greek word.
It is a staggering thought, honestly. But, modern readers have a terrible habit of projecting contemporary categories onto ancient texts.
Yeah, we really do.
We just assume people living in the Roman Empire thought like us, organized their world into neat little boxes like us, and, well, used words the way we do. But they lived in an entirely different conceptual universe.
Right, a hardware is totally different.
Yes. When we take a modern dictionary, find an ancient Greek word, and just plug in the modern English equivalent, we assume the case is closed. But doing that often destroys the actual historical meaning of the text.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking, everyone. We are jumping into our deep dive for today, and we are taking a thorough look at a linguistic landscape that is, frankly, incredibly messy.
Very messy.
Our whole conversation revolves around a brilliant essay by Matthew Feed Novenson. It is titled Paul's Former Occupation in Ioudaismos, and we are pulling this from the broader academic volume, Galatians and Christian Theology.
It is a fascinating piece of scholarship.
It is, and if you are listening to this and you have read the book of Galatians, you probably thought the same thing I thought. On its face, it looks like Paul is writing a harsh, sweeping critique of the religion of Judaism.
Yeah, it reads like a manifesto against a rival world religion.
But if Novenson is right, that Greek word Paul used in his own autobiography, the word ioudaisemos, it means something radically different.
The central question we are tackling today is what Paul actually meant when he described his past life in the first chapter of Galatians, verses 13 and 14.
Because if we get that one word wrong,
then the entire landscape of the letter shifts.
Yeah.
It goes from a theological debate about world religions to something far more political, historical, and highly specific.
So to pace ourselves here, we are going to start by looking at the historical misunderstandings. Then we will dig into the linguistic anomalies of ancient Greek.
Always fun.
Right. And finally, we will reconstruct Paul's true historical and political context.
Sounds like a solid plan.
So I was looking at the timeline of how people interpreted this letter, and it seems like everyone from the early church fathers to the Protestant reformers just took for granted that Judaism was a world religion that Paul hated.
They did.
Why did so many brilliant minds fall into that same interpretive trap for centuries?
So to understand the trap, we have to look at the historical water those thinkers were swimming in. This misunderstanding, it did not start in the modern era.
Okay.
We can actually trace a clear line from late antiquity all the way to 20th century scholarship. And the starting point is really a figure named Ignatius of Antioch.
Tell me more about the context around Ignatius, because he is writing in the early 2nd century, right?
Yes, early 2nd century.
This is a time when the early Jesus movement is really trying to figure out its identity.
Correct. They were in a highly precarious position within the Roman Empire. And Ignatius is actually the writer who introduces a firm distinction between the Greek terms Ioudaismos and Christianismos.
Oh, he coins that distinction.
He essentially sets them up as opposing forces, yes.
Good.
He wrote to local churches claiming that it is absurd to profess Jesus Christ and at the same time follow Jewish customs.
Wow.
He was trying to build a solid, impenetrable wall between the two groups.
So he is creating two distinct buckets. Two distinct religious systems.
Exactly.
And he needed to do that because the lines were incredibly blurry at the time. I mean, a lot of early believers in Jesus were Jewish and obviously continued living as Jewish people.
Right. They did not see a conflict.
But Ignatius comes along and says, no, these are mutually exclusive categories.
And that boundary drawing, it became the default lens for reading Paul. And then a few decades later, along comes a man named Marcion of Sinope.
Oh, boy. Marcion.
Yeah, Marcion. He takes this distinction to an absolute extreme. He looked at the Hebrew scriptures and the texts of the early Christian movement and concluded there must literally be two separate gods.
A two-God system. That is a massive leap. How does someone read these texts and then conclude there are two entirely different deities?
Well, you have to remember, Marcion lived in a Greco-Roman culture that highly valued philosophical dualism.
Oh, like the material world is bad, spiritual world is good.
Yes, that is the core idea. The physical material world is flawed, and the spiritual world is pure. So Marcion decided that the God of the Old Testament, God of the Jews, was this harsh, legalistic creator deity who made our flawed material world.
Okay, I see where he's going with this.
In contrast, he believed the supreme loving God of the spiritual realm was newly revealed by Jesus Christ.
Wow.
And for Marcion, Galatians was the ultimate proof text. He read it as the story of a cosmic conflict between two opposing religions, backed by two opposing gods.
Which the early church obviously recognized as a massive problem. They pushed back against that two-God theory quite aggressively.
Oh, they fought back hard, primarily through figures like Tertullian.
The apologist from North Africa.
Well, that is him. Tertullian fought fiercely against Marcion's system. He insisted there is only one God who created the world and sent Jesus. However, and this is the crucial part, Tertullian agreed with Marcion's basic reading of the Galatians text itself.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Tertullian agreed that the epistle was a decisive text against Judaismos. He rejected the two gods theory, but he entirely accepted the two opposing religions theory.
So the narrative hardens right there.
It absolutely does.
Even the people fighting the heretics agree on this one fundamental reading of Paul's letter. They all agree Paul is attacking a religion.
And that reading passes right down the line to Augustine in the late 4th and early 5th centuries.
And Augustine had a huge impact on Western thought.
Massive. He framed the issue in a way that shaped centuries of theology. Augustine lived during the slow collapse of the Roman Empire, and he thought a lot about the city of man versus the city of God.
Right.
He argued that if Paul said he advanced in Ioudaismos by persecuting the church, then clearly Judaismos itself is opposed to the church.
That makes a kind of superficial sense.
It does. Augustine framed it as a problem with his words, carnal and slavish way of life of the Jewish people themselves, contrasting it with the spiritual freedom of the church.
You can easily see how that interpretation would shape centuries of hostility.
Very easily.
It sets up this zero-sum game where one side has to lose for the other to win.
And that zero-sum game crosses right over into the Reformation in the 16th century.
Let's talk about Luther.
Yes, Martin Luther. When Luther read Paul's phrase about his former occupation in Judaism, Luther was fighting his own massive institutional war with the Catholic Church over the sale of indulgences and church corruption.
Right, he had a very specific lens.
So Luther equated Paul's critique with any religious system that trusts in its own merits.
He just maps his own 16th century battles right onto a first century text.
He maps it perfectly. Luther used the term as a cipher. He applied it to the Pope, the Turks, the Jews, and anyone he saw as relying on human works rather than divine grace.
It basically becomes a universal catch-all for bad religion.
It does, and that pattern persists straight into the modern era. Take Rudolf Bultmann, a highly influential 20th century scholar. He saw Galatians 1 as God's condemnation of Jewish striving after righteousness.
Which again reflects the time he lived in.
Exactly. Think about the context. Post-World War Europe, where human progress and institutions had spectacularly failed. Scholars like Karl Barth and J. Louis Martin framed the letter as a universe-level clash of opposites, divine action versus human religion.
Right, yeah.
By the logic of their reading, the Judaism of Paul's day fell firmly on the human religion side of that equation.
Reading Galatians as a textbook against a world religion is like trying to run modern software on vintage hardware.
Oh, I like that.
The system just was not built to process that concept. You have all these historical heavyweights, Augustine, Luther, Barth, trying to boot up a modern understanding of world religions on a first century letter.
And the hardware is rejecting the code.
Yes. The hardware rejects it. So if all these brilliant historical minds read it this way for almost 2,000 years, what specific clue made modern scholars realize they might be misinterpreting the text entirely?
Well, the shift started with a linguistic observation published in 2007 by a scholar named Steve Mason.
Okay, 2007, so this is very recent.
Very recent. Mason essentially shifted the entire conversation away from heavy centuries-old theological assumptions. He forced everyone to look at basic Greek grammar and ancient sociology.
Tell me about Steve Mason's proposal, because this is where the conventional wisdom gets completely flipped upside down.
Mason pointed out a glaring historical anachronism. He argued that the concept of Judaism as a religion simply did not exist in the Greco-Roman world.
Wait, Not just that Paul didn't mean it, but the concept didn't exist at all.
Correct.
Yeah.
The entire category of religion was absent from the ancient mindset.
That is hard to wrap your head around today.
It is. Today, we think of religion as a discrete set of beliefs, right? A private conviction you can choose to adopt or leave. Ancient people did not think that way. They belonged to ethnic groups.
So an ancient person wouldn't say, I am converting to the religion of the Egyptians.
No, never.
They would say, I am adopting the ancestral customs of the Egyptian ethnic group.
Yes. Ancient ethnic groups had ancestral traditions, geographical homelands, local laws, and specific gods tied to their specific lands. To adopt the gods was to adopt the whole ethnic package.
That makes sense.
And this brings us to the Greek verb ioudaizo, which is typically translated into English as to judaize.
Right.
Mason pointed out that this verb does not mean to believe in the Jewish religion. It means to act like a Jew or to adopt Jewish customs.
This is a crucial distinction. It is not about mental assent to a doctrine. It is about taking on the physical and cultural habits of a specific people group.
Exactly. And here is the grammatical linchpin that changes everything. In ancient Greek, the subject of the verb ioudaismo is always, without exception, a non-Jew.
Wait, really? A Jewish person cannot judaize?
They cannot, any more than a Greek person can Hellenize or a Mede can Medeize.
Oh, wow.
In the Greek language, these verbs ending in -izo signify the adoption of native practices by non-native persons.
Let me make sure I follow.
Think about it. A Mede does not act like a Mede. They just are a Mede. A Greek does not adopt Greek customs. They just live their daily life.
Right.
A Jewish person does not adopt Jewish customs. They just live their ancestral life. Therefore, the only people who can Judaize are Gentiles taking on foreign habits.
That makes perfect logical sense. Let's make this concrete for the listener because the source material provides 3 specific ancient examples to prove this point.
Let's do it.
I was looking at the first example from the text of Galatians itself in chapter 2, verse 14. This is the famous incident at Antioch.
Ah, yes. It is a highly tense social situation.
Set the scene for us.
Paul is rebuking Peter publicly. Peter had been eating with the Gentile believers, sharing table fellowship with them. But when some traditionalist visitors arrived from Jerusalem, Peter got nervous.
He gets cold feet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He pulls away, stopping his meals with the Gentiles to appease the visitors. Paul confronts him and says, "If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to Judaize?"
Notice the phrasing Paul uses there. Peter is not Judaizing. Peter is a Jewish man. Peter is compelling the Gentiles to Judaize. He is forcing non-Jews to adopt Jewish customs, like specific dietary laws, just so they can be allowed back to the dinner table.
Right. The pressure's on the outsiders to conform to the insider ethnic customs.
So the grammatical subject of the action of Judaizing is the Gentile group.
Always. And the second example Novenson cites comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, specifically the book of Esther, chapter 8, verse 17.
I love the story of Esther. Set the political scene in the Persian court for us there, because the context really explains why people would suddenly start changing their habits.
The context is a massive reversal of fortunes. A high official named Haman had manipulated the Persian king into issuing a decree to annihilate all the Jews in the empire.
A total genocide order.
Yes. But Queen Esther intervenes, Haman is executed on his own gallows, and a new decree goes out, allowing the Jewish people to arm and protect themselves.
So the balance of power flips overnight.
And the narrator reports that out of fear of the Jews, many of the Gentiles in the land underwent circumcision and Judaized.
Again, it is the non-Jews who are Judaizing. Out of sheer political terror, these Persian citizens are adopting the physical markers and customs of the Jewish ethnic group.
They are doing it to blend in and save their own lives.
Right. They're not converting to a theology. They are adopting an ethnic camouflage.
That is a great way to put it. Our third piece of evidence comes from classical Roman literature. Plutarch wrote a biography of the famous orator Cicero.
Okay, switching gears to Roman politics.
Yes. In this text, Cicero is prosecuting a corrupt former governor named Verres. One of the people trying to lead the accusation against Verres is a freedman named Caecilius.
Okay.
The text notes that Caecilius is accused of Judaizing.
Meaning he is a Roman citizen improperly following Jewish customs rather than his own local Roman customs.
Exactly.
Maybe he was refusing to eat pork or observing a Sabbath, and Cicero just mocks him for it in public.
Cicero uses it as a straight-up insult in the courtroom. So across all these different types of literature, a letter from Paul, a Hellenistic Jewish narrative in Esther, and a classical Roman biography by Plutarch, the verb ioudaizo, always refers to non-Jews adopting Jewish ways.
Okay, let's follow the logic here, because if the verb ioudaizo means Gentiles adopting Jewish customs, then we have to look at the noun form of that word.
We do.
The noun is Ioudaismos. Logically, in standard grammar, the noun describes the action of the verb. Therefore, Ioudaismos should logically mean the adoption of Jewish customs by non-Jews.
That is the exact conclusion Steve Mason drew in his 2007 paper.
He is basically saying Ioudaismos is the Judaizing industry.
Yes.
And if Mason's logic holds up, it completely rewrites Paul's autobiography.
How so?
Well, when Paul says in Galatians 1 that his former occupation was in Ioudaismos, Mason concludes that Paul must be confessing that he worked as a missionary for Gentiles before his conversion to Christ.
Ah, yes.
The theory implies Paul was traveling around the Mediterranean trying to convince pagan Gentiles.
It would be a staggering biographical shift. We would have to picture a pre-Christian Paul who is already running a mission to the Gentiles, just a different kind of mission.
He would be an agent of assimilation.
But there is a flaw in that theory, isn't there?
There is a big one. Mason's logic relies entirely on the assumption that language always follows strict mathematical rules.
And that is the catch. Mason's logic is perfectly sound on paper, but as Novenson points out in our source text, language does not always behave logically.
It really doesn't.
Sometimes, language breaks its own rules in the real world.
Which brings us to the epigraphic evidence.
Yes, the hard evidence.
We are looking at actual stones carved in the ancient world, not just textbook grammar. Novenson presents a brilliant counter-argument to Mason, proving that while Mason is right about the verb, he is wrong about the noun.
Novenson points out the standard Greek pattern. Verbs ending in izo turn into nouns ending in ismos. These nouns denote the action of the subject of the verb. Take the verb baptizo, which means to perform a water ritual. It becomes the noun baptismos, the ritual washing itself.
Makes sense.
Katharizo, to purify, becomes katharismos, a purification. The pattern is incredibly consistent. Ioudaismo to ioudaizo should follow suit.
But the stones tell a different story.
They really do. Novenson proves that in all pre-Christian instances where the noun ioudaisos is used, it is an activity practiced by Jewish people.
Wow. Use belies etymology.
Exactly. The way real people spoke on the street contradicted the textbook grammar.
We have to bring in the hard archaeological evidence to back this up. Novenson points to two specific inscriptions from the Roman period that blow a hole in Mason's theory.
Let's look at the first one. It is a funerary inscription, an epitaph from the 3rd or 4th century. It was found in Porto, a port city near Rome with a significant Jewish diaspora community. It honors a woman named Katia Ammias. The carved stone reads, Katia Ammias, daughter of Monophilus, the father of the synagogue of the Carcaresians, lived virtuously in Ioudaismos, having dwelt 34 years with her spouse.
Let's analyze that stone. Katia Ammias is undeniably a Jewish woman.
Without a doubt.
Her father is literally the father of the synagogue, and the public monument says she lived virtuously in Ioudaismos. She is the one doing the action, a Jewish woman practicing Ioudaismos.
It completely shatters the idea that only non-Jews can participate in it.
It does. And the second inscription provides even more proof.
Yes, this one is a synagogue benefaction record from the city of Stobi in Macedonia, dating to the 3rd century. It honors a prominent Roman citizen named Claudius Tiberius Polycarmus.
Quite a name.
Right. He is also given the official title Father of the Synagogue at Stobi. The public inscription states that he, quote, administered every policy in accordance with Ioudaismos, and in fulfillment of a vow gave his own property to expand the holy place.
Again, we have a prominent Jewish leader, a synagogue father, handling administrative policies for his community. His actions are described as being in accordance with Ioudaismos.
So the grammatical subject in these real-world examples is undeniably a Jewish person.
I know Mason tries to cautiously suggest that maybe Polycarmus was a Gentile convert who became a synagogue leader.
He does suggest that, but there is zero positive evidence for that outside of Mason's own grammatical theory.
It's a stretch.
It is a massive stretch. The most straightforward reading of the hard evidence is that Jewish people are practicing Ioudaismos.
Think of it like the English words flammable and inflammable.
Oh, that is a great comparison.
This trips people up all the time. Logically, based on the prefix in, they should be exact opposites. If something is flammable, it catches fire. If it is inflammable, it logically should not catch fire.
Like invisible means not visible.
Exactly. But historically, because of the way the Latin root evolved and how workers actually use the warning labels in the real world, both words mean the exact same thing.
They both mean the object will burst into flames.
Language is messy. Etymology is not always destiny.
That is a highly effective way to frame it. The messy shifts of daily language use create an anomaly, and that anomaly becomes fixed as a new pattern of speech. Ioudaismos is one of those anomalies. It breaks the izo to ismos rule.
But this raises an immediate counterargument. If Ioudaismos just means what Jews do, aren't we right back to square one?
How do you mean?
Does that not just mean the religion of Judaism? Are we just doing a massive linguistic circle to end up agreeing with Augustine and Luther that Paul was attacking a world religion?
That is the critical question. And the answer is a resounding no.
Okay, why?
Because while Ioudaismos is something Jews do, it is not something all Jews do. It does not mean everyday, baseline Jewish religious life. It means something far more specific and far more intense.
Okay.
To understand what it really means, we have to trace the word back to its absolute origin, which takes us to a bloody revolution in the 2nd century BCE.
We have to go to the forge where this word was actually created.
Yes.
This is where the history gets incredibly gripping. The word Ioudaismos was not coined by scholars in a library debating theology. It was coined in the trenches of the Maccabean revolt.
We find the very first uses of the word in the historical text of 2nd Maccabees. The background here is a severe existential crisis for the Jewish people living under the Seleucid Empire.
Specifically under a king named Antiochus V Epiphanes.
Yes.
Paint the picture for us. What is happening in Jerusalem that leads to this crisis?
It begins as a culture war that eventually turns lethal. You had a rogue high priest in Jerusalem named Jason.
Rogue priest, okay.
Jason wanted to modernize the city, which at that time meant making it Greek. He was pushing a political and cultural program called Hellenismos.
And what did that involve practically?
This involved building a Greek gymnasium right under the citadel in Jerusalem. Now, a Greek gymnasium was not just a place to lift weights. It was the center of Greek civic and educational life. And men exercised completely naked. For Jewish youth to participate, they were essentially publicly repudiating the physical mark of the covenant circumcision. Wow. Jason also encouraged young men to wear Greek hats, fundamentally adopting the customs of the ruling empire.
So the author of 2nd Maccabees views this as an extreme adoption of foreign ways.
Yes, an absolute disaster for their ancestral traditions.
And Antiochus V eventually escalates this from soft cultural pressure to violent state-sponsored persecution.
He outlaws basic Jewish practices under penalty of death.
It is brutal.
It is. He desecrates the temple in Jerusalem by sacrificing pigs on the altar. He makes it a capital offense to possess the Torah. He sends soldiers to inspect villages and murder mothers who circumcise their infants.
So in response to this aggressive, violent campaign of Hellenismos, the author of 2nd Maccabees invents a new word as a dicta-contrast term.
Yes.
And that word is Ioudaismos.
And this is vital for understanding Paul later on. In 2nd Maccabees, Ioudaismos does not mean everyday Jewish life.
Because everyday life didn't need a word.
Right. Before Antiochus showed up, everyday Jewish life didn't need a special ioudaizo word. It was just life. You woke up, you observed the Sabbath, you ate the food of your ancestors.
Yeah.
The word ioudaizo was coined to mean the defense of Jewish ancestral traditions under severe violent duress.
It is a battle cry.
It is a rallying flag. The text highlights specific characters to illustrate this concept in action.
Let's talk about Judah Maccabee.
Yes, Judah Maccabee, the famous military leader. He's described as enlisting those who had persevered in Ioudaismos. He is gathering an army of zealous activists to fight a guerrilla war against the empire.
And then there is the intense story of a man named Razis.
Razis, yes.
Tell me about Razis, because his story shows just how high the stakes were.
Razis was an elder of Jerusalem. The text calls him a father of the Jews. He says he was indicted for Ioudaismos and risked his body and soul for Ioudaismos.
Okay, so he is a target.
A prime target.
Right.
When the Greek soldiers come to arrest him rather than submit to their torture and defilement, he falls on his own sword.
Wow.
But the wound is not fatal. So he throws himself off a wall into the crowd. And finally, bleeding out, he pulls out his own internal organs and throws them at the soldiers, calling upon God to return them to him in the resurrection.
That is wow.
He dies a gruesome, defiant martyr's death. He is the ultimate, extreme example of this concept.
So Ioudaismos in this context is what zealous Jews do.
Yes.
It is what militant Jews do when their entire way of life is threatened with extinction.
Matthew Novenson brings in a brilliant concept from the sociologist Peter Berger that really crystallizes how a normal daily habit becomes a militant action. It is called the heretical imperative.
Walk me through how that applies to the Maccabean crisis.
Berger notes that in a traditional society, following the rules of your culture is just basic existence. It requires no conscious thought or choice. It is simply what is done.
Right, it's just the water you swim in.
But when a society is suddenly exposed to competing worldviews, or in this case, violent suppression, the situation changes drastically. The individual is forced to make a conscious choice to maintain their traditions.
They have to opt in.
Exactly. That necessity of choosing is the heretical imperative.
Let's break that down with a modern analogy. Think about wearing a specific color of clothing.
Okay.
Say you throw on a blue shirt. Normally, putting on a blue shirt means absolutely nothing. You just grabbed it out of the closet. It is the background hum of getting dressed.
Right.
But imagine you are living through a violent political uprising and a rebel faction has claimed blue as their official color. The ruling government has banned the color entirely. Suddenly, walking out your front door wearing a blue shirt is no longer a neutral act of getting dressed. It becomes a loud, undeniable declaration of allegiance.
You are choosing a side.
You are risking your life just by putting on a shirt.
That parallel captures the dynamic perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Before the persecution by Antiochus, keeping a kosher diet or circumcising a child was just the background hum of daily life in Judea.
Yeah.
It was what everyone did.
Yeah.
But under Antiochus, when those acts were explicitly outlawed under penalty of death, simply refusing to eat pork became an incendiary political statement. It became an act of militant defiance.
So Ioudaismos was the name of a political cause,
Yeah.
an activist movement. It was a sectarian program. It was not a broad world religion encompassing every single person who lived in Judea. It was the specific radical choice to fight for the ancestral ways.
And not all Jews practiced Ioudaismos, because not all Jews were activists or fighters. Many probably just tried to keep their heads down and survive the occupation.
Just trying to get by.
Right. Ioudaismos was the domain of the zealous.
So with this massive historical context established, moving from the Maccabean battlefields and the invention of this word as a marker of political resistance, we have to take this new, historically accurate definition and plug it directly back into the scriptural text of Galatians.
This is where the lights really turn on for the text.
Let's look at Paul's autobiography again.
Yes, keeping the ghost of Judah Maccabee in the back of our minds.
I am going to read the core verses, Galatians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. But instead of using the traditional English translation, Judaism, I am going to substitute Novenson's suggested gloss based on all this history.
Which is the generalization movement.
Right. Listen to how dramatically this alters the tone. Paul writes, "For you heard of my former occupation in the Judaization movement, that I was persecuting the Church of God severely and was destroying it, and was advancing in the Judaization movement beyond many of my peers among my people, being exceedingly zealous for my ancestral traditions."
It fundamentally changes the nature of his confession.
It really does. Let's analyze the specific Greek words Paul chooses here.
Okay, he talks about his former occupation. The Greek word is anastrophe, which means a distinct pattern of activity or conduct, a way of operating.
Like a career or a campaign.
Yes. He talks about how he was advancing beyond his peers, showing ambition within a structured movement. He describes himself as being exceedingly zealous for the ancestral traditions.
And the consequence of that extreme zeal was that he was violently persecuting the church.
The vocabulary he uses, zeal, advancing, persecuting ancestral traditions, it perfectly matches the militant activist tone of 2nd Maccabees.
He sounds exactly like the soldiers enlisting with Judah Maccabee to purge the land of foreign influence.
He paints a picture of himself as a partisan enforcer.
Mm-hmm.
And if Paul simply meant that he used to be a devout, everyday Jewish person, he would not use this specific politically charged word.
How can we be sure of that?
We know this for a fact because we have other letters where Paul talks about his normal Jewish religious background, and he completely avoids the word Ioudaismos.
Look at Romans chapter 9 or Philippians chapter 3.
Excellent examples. In those texts, he is definitely talking about his heritage.
Right.
In Romans 9, he talks about his sorrow for his people. He lists their privileges of the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises.
And in Philippians 3, he lists his personal credentials. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee.
Exactly. In all of those detailed descriptions of standard Jewish identity and religious practice, the word Ioudaismos is completely absent.
Because in those passages, he is just talking about his daily life, his birthright, his heritage.
Right.
But in Galatians 1, he is making a very specific, targeted confession. He is confessing to his past as a political activist.
A militant enforcer of traditionalist boundaries?
He saw the early Jesus movement as a massive threat to the ancestral traditions, just like the Maccabees saw Hellenism as a threat, and he took violent action to suppress it.
He was part of a movement dedicated to the aggressive defense of Jewish ancestral ways. That is what he means when he says he was advancing in Ioudaismos. He was climbing the ranks of an activist movement.
I have a critical question regarding the rest of the letter.
Go for it.
We have established that in Galatians 1, Paul is talking about his violent activist past, not his everyday religion. But if Paul was so focused on this activist movement in his autobiography, what does he actually think about the everyday non-activist religion of his Jewish contemporaries in the rest of the book of Galatians?
That is a great point to bring up.
Because the traditional reading assumes the whole letter is a sustained assault on Jewish religious practice as a means of salvation. Is he attacking everyday Jewish life later in the letter?
To find Paul's view on the daily religious life itself within this specific letter, we have to look very carefully at chapters 2 and 6.
Okay.
Novenson argues that the traditional reading misses the actual conflict entirely. Paul is not attacking the Jewish heritage.
So what is the actual conflict happening in Galatia? Who is he angry with?
The true target of Galatians is not Jewish religion acting as a rival means of justification before God. His target is the prospect of Gentile believers Judaizing. That is, non-Jews adopting Jewish customs in order to secure their status within the community.
Let's break down Galatians chapter 2, verses 15 and 16, because this is often cited as the core theological thesis of the entire letter.
Right. Paul writes, "We who are Jews by nature and not sinners from among the Gentiles know that a person is not justified from works of the law except through the faith of Jesus Christ."
Okay, the traditional reading here.
The traditional post-Reformation reading usually assumes Paul is saying, we Jews thought the law justified us, but now we know we were wrong.
Right.
But Novenson highlights a completely different reading based on the Greek syntax. Paul is saying that Jews know better than to make the category mistake of trying to use the law as a mechanism for justification.
Wait, say that again? That is a massive paradigm shift. You are saying Paul thinks his fellow Jewish people already understand how grace works.
Yes. Paul is saying to Peter, look, you and I are Jews by birth. We know how our ancestral covenant works. We know that the law was never a ladder you climb to earn justification. The law was given after the covenant of grace was established. It is the pagan Gentiles, the ones who are brand new to this whole concept of the God of Israel, who are confused.
They don't have the background.
Right. They're the ones who think they need to adopt these ethnic markers like adult circumcision or dietary laws to earn their way into God's favor.
Think of it like someone walking into a bank trying to pay off a mortgage with monopoly money.
Oh, that is good.
The experienced bank teller looks at them and says, "We know better than to think this paper holds any value here. Why are you letting this new customer think they have to earn their status using counterfeit currency?"
That is exactly it.
Paul is essentially saying to Peter, we know the score. Why are you letting these Gentiles think they need to Judaize to be right with God?
The problem in the Galatian churches is not that Jewish people are practicing their ancestral traditions. The problem is that non-Jewish people are being heavily pressured by outside agitators to adopt those traditions as a false mechanism for salvation.
Got it. Paul's anger is directed entirely at that ethno-spending pressure, not at the Jewish heritage itself.
Yes.
This shifts how we read the closing lines of the letter, too.
Yeah.
Let's move to Galatians chapter 6, verse 16.
Okay.
Paul uses this very famous phrase, the Israel of God. He says, "As many as follow this rule, peace be upon them, and mercy also upon the Israel of God." Who is he actually talking about there?
Historically, many commentators have argued that the Israel of God is a spiritualized term for the Christian church, suggesting the church has completely replaced ethnic Israel.
Right.
But Novenson brings in the analysis of scholar Susan Eastman, who argues quite persuasively that Paul's referring directly to the ethnic Jewish people.
What evidence does she use to support that reading? Because that pushes against a lot of standard commentary.
She looks at Paul's consistent vocabulary across all his writings. Everywhere else, Paul uses the word Israel in his letters to the Romans, Corinthians, Philippians. It invariably refers to the Jewish ethnos, the physical descendants of Abraham.
So always ethnic.
Always. There is no logical reason to assume he suddenly changed his vocabulary to mean something purely spiritual right at the end of this one letter.
That makes total sense.
Eastman suggests Paul is offering a two-part blessing. Paul wishes peace upon his Galatian audience who follow his rule, meaning the Gentile believers who stand firm and refuse to Judaize.
And then?
And then as a separate thought, he wishes mercy upon Israel.
Meaning his fellow Jewish people, including those who do not currently follow Jesus.
Yes. He anticipates that the mission of Peter the Apostolate to the circumcision mentioned earlier in chapter 2 will eventually bring them into the Messianic fold. In Galatians, Paul's non-Christian Jewish kinfolk are not the enemy. They are the recipients of his hope for God's mercy.
So if Galatians is not the place where Paul systematically dismantles Jewish observance, where does he actually deal with the theological status of the law? Because we know he writes extensively about it.
He deals with that complex theological burden in his letter to the Romans.
Oh, Romans.
Yes. Romans is where Paul wrestles deeply with the fact that the mission to his Jewish kinfolk has not been as universally successful as he hoped. That is where you find his intense anguish over his people and his intricate, sustained arguments about the law, righteousness, and God's sovereign choices.
But even when we read Romans, we have to be extremely careful not to project our modern dictionary definitions backward.
Absolutely. As the renowned scholar E.P. Sanders noted decades ago, even at the very end of his life, Paul did not imagine Judaism as the broad, systematic concept we hold today.
Right.
He was dealing with his literal kinfolk, his physical traditions, and his fiery conviction that the promised Messiah had finally arrived.
He was not debating a rival Eliism in a modern comparative religions seminar.
No, not at all. He was a first-century man dealing with a first-century crisis.
Let's synthesize this entire conversation because it covers a massive amount of historical and linguistic ground, but it is incredibly clarifying.
It really brings it all together.
We started with a 2,000-year-old misunderstanding. From Ignatius to Augustine, from Luther to Bultmann, the prevailing assumption was that Galatians was Paul's manifesto attacking the religion of Judaism.
But then we looked at the linguistic anomaly brought to light by Steve Mason.
Right, the verb ioudaizo always refers to Gentiles adopting Jewish customs.
And yet, the noun Ioudaismos stubbornly refers to something Jewish people themselves do, breaking the standard rules of Greek grammar.
To resolve that linguistic anomaly, we had to go back to the Maccabean battlefields.
The forge.
The forge. We discovered that Ioudaismos was forged in the literal fires of persecution under Antiochus Epiphanes. It was never a word for everyday religion. It was a battle cry.
It was the name of an activist political cause.
A zealous movement to forcefully defend ancestral traditions under the threat of torture and death.
And when we plug that historical definition back into Galatians chapter 1, Paul's autobiography snapped into sharp focus.
He was not saying, I used to follow the Jewish religion, but now I don't.
No. He was confessing, I used to be a violent militant in the traditionalist movement, a partisan persecutor of anything I saw as a threat to our customs.
And finally, we saw that Paul's actual anger in the letter to the Galatians is directed at Gentiles who are trying to Judaize to earn their justification.
Yes.
He calls out this behavior as a category mistake that he says his fellow Jews should know better than to make.
Shifting the definition of one single word, Ioudaismos, completely alters the landscape of one of the most debated letters in antiquity.
It moves it from a theological attack on a world religion to a nuanced pastoral intervention about grace, ethnic identity, and social pressure.
It forces us to read the text on its own terms, in its own century, rather than forcing the text to answer modern questions it was never asking.
Which leaves us with a massive question to ponder. I want to leave you with this final thought to work through on your own.
This is the big one.
If the Apostle Paul, one of the most prolific writers of the New Testament, did not even possess a word for the broad, encompassing religion of Judaism as we conceptualize it today, how many other modern cultural categories are we accidentally projecting backward onto ancient texts? When we open these letters, are we listening to a genuine first-century voice, or are we just hearing an echo of our own modern debates reflected back at us? If we read our own world into their words, whose voice are we really hearing?
Something to really sit with.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the messy, fascinating world of ancient texts. We will catch you next time on Reformed Thinking.